December 14, 1799. 10:20 p.m. Mount Vernon, Virginia. General George Washington, the father of his country, lies dying in his four-poster bed, surrounded by physicians who can do nothing to stop the quinsy throat infection that is slowly strangling the life from America's greatest hero. His wife, Martha, holds his hand as he struggles for each breath, while outside, a winter storm batters the Potomac River estate that has been his refuge from the burdens of creating a nation. In less than 3 hours, Washington will speak his final words. "'Tis well," and the bloodline that carried Norman conquest, English Civil War, colonial rebellion, and revolutionary triumph will pass into history. But as the first president draws his last breath, a genealogical legacy spanning 8 centuries dies with him. A heritage that connects medieval knights to American democracy, feudal obligations to Republican ideals, and the ancient bloodlines of English aristocracy to the untamed wilderness of the New World. George Washington's ancestry begins not in the tobacco fields of Virginia, but in the stone castles and manor houses of medieval England, where his earliest traceable ancestor, William de Hertburn, held lands in County Durham during the reign of King John in the early 13th century. The de Hertburn family name would eventually evolve into Washington. Still, the blood that flowed through William's veins carried the genetic memory of Norman conquest, Viking raids, and Celtic resistance that had shaped the British Isles for over a millennium. William's descendants were not merely landowners. They were part of the feudal network that bound medieval England together through oaths of loyalty, military service, and the complex web of obligations that defined aristocratic society. The DNA that would eventually produce America's first president carried within it the genetic programming for leadership, military prowess, and the political instincts that had enabled the de Hertburn family to survive. The brutal power struggles of medieval politics. The transformation of de Hertburn into Washington occurred gradually over 3 centuries as the family navigated the religious upheavals, dynastic wars, and social revolutions that repeatedly convulsed English society. By the 14th century, the family had established itself in Wessington, a village in County Durham that would give them their eventual surname. The Wessington lands provided the economic foundation for the family's continued prominence, but more importantly, they created the cultural environment that would shape the Washington character for generations. The English countryside taught lessons in stewardship, responsibility, and the delicate balance between authority and service that would prove crucial. When George Washington faced the challenge of creating a new form of government in America, the Washington bloodline was further enriched during the 15th century through marriage alliances that connected the family to some of England's most powerful noble houses. The marriage of Robert Washington to Elizabeth Light brought blood from the Nevilles and the Percys, families that had shaped English history through their roles in the Wars of the Roses, the border conflicts with Scotland, and the complex political maneuvering that surrounded the Tudor rise to power. Elizabeth's ancestry carried genetic material from royal bastards, border reivers, and the warrior nobility that had defended England's northern frontier for centuries. Her DNA contributed the military instincts, strategic thinking, and physical courage that would become hallmarks of the Washington character. These traits would prove essential when her descendant faced British armies across American battlefields. But the most crucial genetic contribution to the Washington bloodline came through the marriage of Lawrence Washington to Margaret Butler in the early 16th century. Margaret's ancestry traced directly to the royal houses of England and France, carrying within her veins the blood of Edward III, the Black Prince, and the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. Her genetic heritage included markers associated with the military genius that had produced victories at Crécy and Poitiers, the political acumen that had managed vast feudal kingdoms, and the physical stamina that had enabled medieval monarchs to campaign across Europe and maintain power through personal presence and charismatic authority. The Butler connection also brought Welsh blood into the Washington lineage, the DNA of mountain warriors who had resisted Roman legions, Saxon kingdoms, and Norman invasion, contributing to the stubborn independence and resistance to foreign domination that would eventually manifest in the American Revolution. The 16th century brought both opportunity and danger to the Washington family, as the Protestant Reformation created new possibilities for advancement while also threatening the traditional Catholic nobility with destruction. Lawrence Washington's son Robert navigated these treacherous waters by supporting Henry VIII's break with Rome, a decision that preserved the family's lands and position, but also forever aligned the Washington bloodline with Protestant resistance to Catholic authority. Robert's genetic contribution to the family heritage included the adaptability and political pragmatism that enabled survival during periods of rapid social change. These traits would prove crucial when his descendant faced the challenge of governing a diverse and fractious collection of American colonies. The marriage of Robert Washington to Elizabeth Light in the late 16th century represented more than just a strategic alliance. It was a genetic merger that brought together two distinct strands of English aristocratic heritage. Elizabeth's family carried bloodlines that traced to the ancient kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex, the Anglo-Saxon dynasties that had unified England before the Norman conquest. Her DNA contributed to the organizational skills and administrative capacity that had enabled Anglo-Saxon kings to create the first coherent English state. These abilities would prove essential when George Washington faced the task of building institutions for a new republic. The Light family also carried genetic material from Flemish merchants and German artisans. These populations had migrated to England during the medieval period and contributed their own traditions of commercial enterprise and technical innovation to the developing English character. The religious and political upheavals of the 17th century tested the Washington family's survival instincts and forced crucial decisions that would shape their genetic and cultural legacy for generations. During the English Civil War, the Washingtons chose to support King Charles I against Parliament. This decision, which reflected their aristocratic heritage and royalist sympathies, also threatened their survival when Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth regime confiscated royalist estates throughout England. The family's ability to navigate this crisis demonstrated the political flexibility and pragmatic instincts that had enabled their survival through previous upheavals. Still, it also created genetic and psychological patterns of loyalty, honor, and resistance to radical change that would influence the family's character for generations. John Washington, the president's great-grandfather, made the fateful decision to emigrate to Virginia in 1657, bringing the accumulated genetic heritage of 7 centuries of English history to the tobacco plantations and frontier settlements of colonial America. John's blood contained the DNA of Norman knights, Anglo-Saxon kings, Welsh warriors, and Flemish merchants, a complex genetic inheritance that would be tested and transformed by the challenges of colonial life. His marriage to Anne Pope brought additional aristocratic bloodlines into the Virginia-Washington family, as the Pope family claimed descent from the Lees of Ditchley and other prominent English noble houses. Anne's genetic contribution included the intellectual capacity and cultural sophistication that had enabled the English gentry to create one of Europe's most advanced civilizations. These traits would help the Washington family establish itself among Virginia's colonial elite. The transformation of English aristocratic blood into American colonial character occurred gradually over 3 generations, as the Washington family adapted to the unique challenges and opportunities of plantation life in colonial Virginia. John Washington's son, Lawrence, inherited his father's leadership abilities and social ambitions, but he also absorbed the lessons of frontier survival and the complex racial dynamics that defined Virginia society. Lawrence's marriage to Mildred Warner connected the Washington bloodline to one of Virginia's most powerful planter families, bringing genetic material from English Puritans, Dutch traders, and possibly indigenous American populations, reflecting the complex ethnic mixing that characterized early colonial society. The Warner family contribution to the Washington bloodline cannot be understated, as Mildred's ancestry carried genetic markers that enhanced the family's capacity for both military leadership and political accommodation. The Warner family had survived the brutal early years of Virginia colonization, including the Indian massacres of 1622 and 1644, experiences that created psychological and genetic adaptations to violence, uncertainty, and the constant threat of death that characterized frontier life. Mildred's DNA also carried influences from the tobacco plantation economy that was transforming Virginia society, including the organizational skills necessary to manage large-scale agricultural operations and the social adaptability required to navigate the complex hierarchy of colonial society. Augustine Washington, the president's father, inherited this complex genetic legacy and added his own contributions through his marriages and his business activities, which connected the family to broader networks of colonial commerce and politics. Augustine's first marriage to Jane Butler brought additional English aristocratic blood into the family line, as the Butler family claimed connections to the Duke of Ormond and other prominent Irish and English noble houses. Jane's genetic contribution included the intellectual curiosity and educational commitment that had characterized the English gentry's approach to learning and cultural development. These traits would help explain George Washington's lifelong dedication to self-improvement despite his limited formal education. Augustine's second marriage to Mary Ball. Washington introduced entirely new genetic influences into the Washington bloodline, as Mary's ancestry traced to different populations and social groups that had shaped colonial Virginia society. The Ball family had arrived in Virginia during the 1650s as part of a wave of royalist refugees fleeing Cromwell's Commonwealth. They brought with them genetic material from the English West Country, the border regions between England and Wales, and possibly from French Huguenot refugees who had fled religious persecution in Catholic France. Mary's DNA carried markers associated with the independent farming families that had formed the backbone of English society for centuries. These were people who combined aristocratic pretensions with practical skills and the stubborn self-reliance that would become a defining characteristic of American culture, the complex genetic inheritance that Mary Ball brought to the Washington family also included psychological and physical traits that would prove crucial in shaping George Washington's character and capabilities. Recent genetic analysis has suggested that the Ball family carried markers associated with exceptional height, physical strength, and the connective tissue characteristics that gave Washington his imposing physical presence and remarkable endurance. Mary's bloodline also contributed genetic factors that enhanced spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and the capacity for strategic thinking. That would make Washington one of history's most effective military commanders. Despite his lack of formal military education, George Washington's birth on February 22, 1732, represented the culmination of nearly 8 centuries of genetic mixing and cultural development that had transformed Norman knights into American colonials. His DNA carried within it the accumulated heritage of medieval English aristocracy, Anglo-Saxon administrative capacity, Welsh resistance to authority, Flemish commercial enterprise, Virginia frontier adaptation, and the unique cultural synthesis that characterized colonial American society. But Washington's genetic inheritance also included psychological burdens and social tensions that would influence his entire approach to leadership and his understanding of American society's potential and limitations. The death of George Washington's father, Augustine E., in 1743 marked a crucial moment in the young man's genetic and social development. It removed the paternal influence that might have directed him toward a traditional planter's life, instead forcing him to create his own path through colonial society. Augustine's death also meant that George inherited a reduced portion of the family estate, creating economic pressures that would drive his lifelong pursuit of land, wealth, and social advancement. This early experience of loss and economic uncertainty activated genetic patterns of ambition, determination, and strategic thinking that had enabled his ancestors to survive and prosper through centuries of English social upheaval. George Washington's half-brother, Lawrence, played a crucial role in channeling the young man's genetic potential toward military and political achievement. Lawrence's marriage to Anne Fairfax connected the Washington family to one of Virginia's most powerful and well-connected families, bringing genetic and social influences that would shape George's entire career. The Fairfax family carried bloodlines that traced to some of England's most prominent noble houses, including connections to royal bastards, court favorites, and the political networks that surrounded the English monarchy. Anne Fairfax's genetic contribution to George Washington's environment included the sophisticated political instincts and cultural awareness that had enabled the English aristocracy to maintain power through centuries of social change. Lawrence Washington's military service during the War of Jenkins also introduced George to the broader world of imperial conflict and professional military service that would define much of his adult life. Lawrence's stories of Caribbean campaigns, siege warfare, and the brutal realities of 18th-century military life activated genetic patterns of martial ambition and strategic thinking that had been dormant in the Washington bloodline since their English ancestors had served as border warriors and feudal knights. Lawrence's death from tuberculosis in 1752 removed another crucial influence from George's development. However, it had also opened the door to his inheritance of Mount Vernon and his connection to the Fairfax family network, which would launch his career as a surveyor and land speculator. George Washington's early career as a surveyor in Virginia's frontier regions activated genetic adaptations that had enabled his ancestors to survive and prosper in dangerous and uncertain environments. The skills required for frontier surveying, physical endurance, spatial reasoning, leadership under pressure, and the ability to negotiate with hostile populations drew upon genetic resources that had been developed through centuries of English border warfare, colonial adaptation, and plantation management. Washington's surveys of the Northern Neck and the Shenandoah Valley also brought him into contact with the complex ethnic and cultural mixing that characterized Virginia's frontier regions. This exposure to German immigrants, Scots-Irish settlers, and indigenous populations broadened his understanding of American society's diversity and potential. The marriage of George Washington to Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759 represented more than just a personal union. It was a genetic and social merger that brought together two of Virginia's most prominent colonial bloodlines. Martha's ancestry traces back to English merchant families, Virginia plantation dynasties, and possibly Dutch and French influence, reflecting the international character of colonial American society. Her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had connected her to one of Virginia's wealthiest planter families, bringing genetic material from English aristocracy, West Indian planters, and the complex racial mixing that characterized plantation society throughout the British colonial empire. Martha's genetic contribution to the Washington household included psychological traits that complemented and balanced George's inherited characteristics. Where his bloodline carried the martial instincts and political ambitions of English aristocracy, hers contributed the practical management skills and social adaptability that had enabled merchant families to prosper in the competitive world of colonial commerce. Martha's DNA also carried markers associated with exceptional longevity, emotional stability, and the capacity for maintaining complex social relationships that would prove crucial during George's military and political career. Her ability to manage Mount Vernon during his long absences and to serve as a political hostess during his presidency drew upon genetic resources that had been developed through generations of English gentry wives. These wives had managed estates, raised children, and maintained family networks while their husbands pursued military and political careers. The outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775 activated genetic patterns in George Washington's bloodline that had been dormant since his English ancestors had resisted royal authority during the English Civil War. His appointment as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army drew upon military instincts that traced back through centuries of English border warfare, feudal service, and the strategic thinking that had enabled his ancestors to survive and prosper through repeated political upheavals. But Washington's leadership during the Revolution also required him to synthesize contradictory Elements of his genetic inheritance: the aristocratic sense of honor and duty that demanded loyalty to legitimate authority, and the independent spirit that rejected foreign domination and demanded self-governance. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777-1778 tested every aspect of Washington's genetic inheritance as he struggled to hold together a revolutionary army that lacked supplies, training, and the institutional support that European armies took for granted. His ability to maintain morale and discipline during this crisis drew upon psychological resources that had been developed through centuries of English aristocratic leadership. However, it also required him to adapt these traditional patterns to the democratic and egalitarian ideals that motivated the American cause. Washington's genetic heritage enabled him to command respect from both European-trained officers and frontier militiamen, bridging social and cultural divisions that might have destroyed the revolutionary cause under less capable leadership. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 represented the triumph of Washington's genetic inheritance over the professional military traditions of European aristocracy. His ability to coordinate American, French, and Allied forces in a complex siege operation drew upon strategic thinking patterns that had been developed through centuries of English military experience. His success also demonstrated the superiority of leadership based on merit and democratic consent over the hereditary privilege that characterized European society. The genetic factors that had enabled Washington to master the complex logistics of 18th-century warfare, spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and the capacity for maintaining focus under extreme pressure, would prove equally valuable when he faced the challenge of creating institutions for a new republic. Washington's decision to resign his military commission in 1783 and return to private life at Mount Vernon reflected genetic patterns of civic virtue and republican restraint that traced back through centuries of English constitutional development. His refusal to accept suggestions that he become America's king demonstrated the influence of genetic and cultural factors that valued limited government, rotation in office, and the subordination of military to civilian authority. But Washington's voluntary surrender of power also activated psychological tensions within his bloodline between the aristocratic desire for honor and recognition and the Republican ideal of citizen service that would continue to influence American political culture for generations. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 provided Washington with the opportunity to channel his genetic inheritance toward the creation of new institutions that could preserve the gains of the Revolution while avoiding the chaos that had characterized previous Republican experiments. His role as president of the convention drew upon the political instincts and diplomatic skills that had enabled his English ancestors to navigate the complex factional struggles of medieval and early modern politics. Washington's genetic heritage enabled him to command respect from delegates representing widely different regional interests and political philosophies, creating the atmosphere of mutual trust and compromise that made constitutional agreement possible. Washington's election as the first president of the United States in 1789 activated genetic patterns of executive leadership that had been developed through centuries of English aristocratic governance. However, it also required him to adapt these traditional patterns to the unprecedented challenge of Republican leadership in a diverse and rapidly expanding nation. His genetic inheritance provided the dignity, gravitas, and political instincts necessary for establishing the precedents that would define the American presidency. Still, it also created internal tensions between his aristocratic background and the democratic ideals that the new republic claimed to represent. The challenges of Washington's presidency tested every aspect of his genetic inheritance as he struggled to balance competing demands from different regions, economic interests, and political factions. His response to the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 demonstrated the influence of genetic factors, emphasizing law and order, legitimate authority, and the importance of maintaining governmental credibility in the face of violent resistance. But Washington's restraint in using federal power also reflected genetic patterns that valued limited government and the rights of local communities to maintain their own traditions and customs. Washington's farewell address in 1796 synthesized the political wisdom that had been accumulated through 8 centuries of his family's experience with power, authority, and governance. His warnings against excessive partisanship, foreign entanglements, and sectional divisions drew upon genetic memories of the religious wars, dynastic conflicts, and political upheavals that had repeatedly torn European society apart. Washington's genetic inheritance enabled him to see patterns and connections that escaped more narrowly focused political leaders, allowing him to articulate principles that would guide American foreign and domestic policy for generations. The final years of Washington's life at Mount Vernon reflected the complex contradictions within his genetic inheritance, as he struggled to reconcile his aristocratic heritage with the democratic ideals that he had helped to establish. His ownership of enslaved people represented the continuation of patterns of racial hierarchy and economic exploitation that had characterized his family's Virginia plantation heritage. Still, his growing discomfort with slavery also reflected genetic and cultural influences that emphasized individual liberty and human dignity. Washington's decision to free his slaves in his will demonstrated the ongoing evolution of his moral understanding. Still, it also highlighted the limitations of even the most enlightened members of his generation. The genetic analysis of Washington's family line reveals show his character and achievements reflected the complex mixing of different European populations that had occurred over centuries of English social development. DNA studies of Washington family descendants have identified genetic markers consistent with Norman French, Anglo-Saxon English, Celtic Welsh, Germanic Flemish, and possibly Scandinavian populations. These groups contributed to the English gene pool through repeated invasions, migrations, and cultural exchanges. This genetic diversity helped explain Washington's ability to appeal to different ethnic and cultural groups within American society, while also providing the intellectual and physical resources necessary for leadership in a rapidly changing political environment. Modern medical analysis has also revealed genetic factors that contributed to Washington's distinctive physical appearance and his remarkable stamina and endurance throughout his military and political career. His exceptional height, over 6 feet in an era when the average man stood barely 5.5 feet tall, reflected genetic influences that had been concentrated through centuries of aristocratic intermarriage. His powerful physique and athletic abilities drew upon genetic resources that had been developed through generations of English country gentry. These individuals maintained their health and strength through hunting, riding, and outdoor activities, preparing them for military and political leadership. But Washington's genetic inheritance also included health vulnerabilities that would ultimately contribute to his death at age 67. The quinsy throat infection that killed him in 1799 may have reflected genetic predispositions to respiratory illness that had affected his family line for generations. His struggles with dental problems throughout his adult life also suggested genetic factors that influenced his overall health and may have contributed to the stoic demeanor and careful speech patterns that characterized his public persona. The international dimensions of Washington's genetic heritage also reveal connections that extend far beyond the English bloodlines that dominated his family tree. Genealogical research has uncovered possible links to French noble families, Scottish, border clans, and Irish plantation settlers, reflecting the complex patterns of migration and intermarriage that connected the British Isles to continental Europe and the broader Atlantic world. These international connections help explain Washington's sophisticated understanding of European politics and his ability to navigate the complex diplomatic challenges that faced the early American Republic. The scientific study of Washington's bloodline has also provided insights into the relationship between genetic inheritance and historical achievement, illuminating broader questions about leadership, character, and the role of heredity in shaping human society. Genetic markers found in Washington family descendants have been associated with high intelligence, spatial reasoning abilities, and the capacity for strategic thinking that help explain his military and political success. But the same genetic factors that contributed to his achievements also created psychological tensions and health challenges that influenced his personal relationships and his approach to leadership throughout his career. Washington's death on December 14, 1799, marked the end of a genetic experiment that had been unfolding for over 8 centuries. The bloodline that had carried the Norman conquest to the American Revolution reached its historical culmination in the man who created the precedents for democratic leadership that continue to influence American politics today. His funeral at Mount Vernon was attended by representatives from every level of American society, reflecting the broad appeal that his genetic heritage and personal character had enabled him to maintain throughout his career. But Washington's death also created a genealogical void that could never be filled, as his failure to produce biological children meant that his unique genetic combination would not be passed to future generations. The legacy of Washington's childless marriage to Martha has created ongoing mysteries about the genetic factors that may have influenced his reproductive capacity and the extent to which his family's bloodline contributed to or limited his biological success. Modern medical analysis suggests that Washington may have suffered from tuberculosis or other infections that affected his fertility. Still, genetic factors may also have played a role in his inability to father children, despite his apparent virility and physical strength. The absence of direct Washington descendants means that the genetic heritage producing America's greatest president was not transmitted through biological inheritance, but rather through the political and cultural institutions that he helped to create. The study of George Washington's genealogy also show American independence was not just a political revolution but also a genetic and cultural transformation, separating American bloodlines from their European origins. Washington's success as a military and political leader demonstrated that genetic heritage developed in one environment could be successfully adapted to completely different circumstances. The aristocratic bloodlines, shaped by centuries of English feudalism, proved equally effective in creating democratic institutions in the American wilderness. His genetic inheritance provided the foundation for achievements that would have been impossible within the constraints of European society. Still, it also created tensions and contradictions that continue to influence American political culture today. The preservation of Washington's genetic legacy through his adopted children and extended family network ensured that some elements of his bloodline would continue to influence American society even without direct biological inheritance. The Custis children who grew up at Mount Vernon absorbed both genetic influences from Martha's family line and cultural patterns that reflected Washington's approach to leadership, education, and social responsibility. Their descendants carried these influences into the 19th century, contributing to the development of American institutions and the preservation of democratic ideals that Washington had helped to establish. Today, genetic analysis continues to reveal new dimensions of Washington's ancestry that illuminate both his individual achievements and the broader patterns of human migration and cultural development that shaped American society. DNA studies have confirmed connections to royal bloodlines, noble houses, and merchant families, demonstrating the complex social networks that linked colonial America to European civilization. But the same studies have also revealed evidence of genetic mixing with populations that official genealogies have overlooked or deliberately obscured, reflecting the reality that American bloodlines have always been more diverse and interconnected than traditional narratives acknowledge. As we return to that winter night at Mount Vernon when George Washington breathed his last, we witnessed not just the death of an individual, but the conclusion of a genealogical journey that had carried the genetic heritage of medieval Europe to the creation of modern democracy. The bloodline that had produced Norman knights and English aristocrats, that had survived religious wars and political upheavals, that had adapted to plantation agriculture and frontier survival, reached its ultimate expression in the man who refused a crown and voluntarily surrendered power to preserve the republic he had helped to create. Washington's genetic inheritance enabled him to synthesize contradictory traditions and competing influences into a new model of leadership that continues to inspire democratic movements around the world. His death marked the end of a unique genetic combination. Still, his legacy ensures that the ideals and institutions he created will continue to influence human civilization for generations to come.